Throughout history, civilizations have shown humanity's remarkable ability to organize, innovate, and make use of the resources at hand. Ancient pyramids, monumental tombs rising from the desert, or cities perched on mountain peaks are just a few examples of the extraordinary achievements of early civilizations. Yet all civilizations, no matter how impressive they may be, eventually face an end, sometimes sudden and always unexpected. Over the centuries, their power fades in ways few could have foreseen. But why does this almost inevitable outcome occur? For a new civilization to emerge, many people are required, along with the ability to ensure they act in a coordinated way. Once established, a civilization tends to expand. The search for new lands brings natural resources, new markets, and trade routes. That expansion makes it possible to create architectural wonders, capable of withstanding the passage of thousands of years, as seen with the pyramids of Egypt. Massive defensive walls and temples built by the Incas mastered the harsh Andean landscape and showcased an unprecedented command of stonework. On the remote island of Rapa Nui, in the heart of the Pacific Ocean, a society emerged that carved enormous moai statues and transported them over long distances in ways we still cannot fully explain. One, reasons for the collapse of civilizations. Amid periods of splendor, subtle signs of decline begin to appear. At times, trade networks become overstretched or disrupted, and the ruling elite fails to meet the growing demands of the population. For example, the Maya civilization experienced numerous internal conflicts between city-states, combined with demographic pressure that demanded more farmland and a reliable water supply. At times, climatic or environmental factors trigger instability. Extreme droughts or the overexploitation of natural resources are often cited as catalysts for decline. Rapa Nui stands as one of the most famous examples. The island, once covered in forest, underwent intensive deforestation to build and transport the moai statues. When a kingdom or civilization reaches the limits of its capacity, whether due to environmental stress, depleted resources, or political instability, only a single external trigger may be needed to set off collapse. In the case of the Incas, the arrival of Spanish conquistadors found the empire already weakened by a civil war between the brothers Huáscar and Atahalpa. This internal division allowed a relatively small group of invaders, aided by dissatisfied subjugated peoples, to overthrow an empire that had seemed indestructible. Meanwhile, Egypt endured multiple conquests over the centuries: Assyrians, Persians, Greeks under Alexander the Great, and eventually the Romans. However, there are other less obvious factors that can play a decisive role in the early stages of decline and complex civilizations. Two, the surprise factor. One of the most unsettling aspects of civilizational collapse is how unexpected it can be. Outside observers, or even the people living within those societies, often fail to notice the problems until it is already too late. The sense of apparent invulnerability, that feeling of limitless power, can become the greatest enemy. When a population places blind trust in its system and loses the ability to adapt, any sudden change can be enough to trigger disaster. In many cases, the tragedy lies in watching monumental structures fall into abandonment, seeing temples and palaces turn into silent ruins while the population scatters or plunges into conflicts that once seemed unthinkable. The collapse of the Minoan civilization stands out clearly. It flourished on the island of Crete with magnificent palaces and extensive maritime trade networks. However, the volcanic eruption of Thera, modern-day Santorini, and possible invasions pushed it into a surprisingly rapid decline. The Mexica, or Aztecs, fell with stunning speed, in barely 2 years after the arrival of the Spanish. Herman Cortés landed in Veracruz in 1519, and by 1521, the majestic city of Tenochtitlan had already been conquered. Another example of swift collapse was the Persian civilization, which in just 4 years was subdued by the precise and relentless campaign of Alexander the Great. In other cases, such as the Maya civilization, decline unfolded over nearly 100 years, ending in the widespread abandonment of major cities. This was likely caused by prolonged droughts, overuse of resources, and warfare between city-states. Next, we will explore some of the greatest civilizations in history, their colossal constructions, and the striking reasons behind their decline. We will also include lesser-known civilizations that are just as fascinating. Three, Egyptian civilization. It emerged along the banks of the Nile River about 5,000 years ago and lasted for an exceptionally long period, until 30 before Christ, spanning roughly 3,000 years. This leads to striking facts, such as the realization that the Egyptian pharaoh Cleopatra lived closer in time to the moon landing than the construction of the pyramids. The Egyptian territory stretched from the Nile Delta in the north to mountainous and arid regions in the south. This fertile strip contrasted sharply with the surrounding deserts. So Egyptians considered themselves blessed to have land where wheat and barley could be grown with relative ease. That natural advantage encouraged the rise of important cities along the river, such as Memphis and Thebes, and allowed the development of an infrastructure of canals and dikes. Among the many structures that have captivated the world, the pyramids stand out, built during the period known as the Old Kingdom. Most notable are those of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure on the Giza Plateau near present-day Cairo. Designed as tombs for the pharaohs, they reflect Egyptian beliefs in the immortality of the soul and in life after death. The exact methods used to build them are still unknown, as historical sources are scarce. Many theories revolve around ramps or simple pulley systems. In the case of the Great Pyramid, it is estimated that around 2.3 million stone blocks were used, each weighing about 2.5 tons, with some exceeding 15 tons. It is believed that construction took close to 20 years, which would have required moving roughly 300 to 340 blocks per day to complete the project on time. River navigation is thought to have made it possible to transport these massive stone blocks. The Papyrus of Merer describes the logistics of moving limestone for the Great Pyramid using boats and a system of canals. The famous Sphinx, a colossal statue with the body of a lion and a human head, was carved directly from the Giza Plateau, probably during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre. Egyptians devoted vast amounts of resources to building temples, palaces, and above all, burial chambers, filled with treasures and offerings meant to ensure the well-being of the deceased in the afterlife. This obsession with life after death also led to major advances in embalming and medicine, as it required anatomical knowledge and the preparation of substances to preserve bodies. The Temple of Luxor, one of the largest Egyptian temples, took advantage of its location next to the Nile to receive blocks of granite and sandstone. Once on site, master craftsmen carved detailed reliefs depicting the deeds of the gods. Thanks to agricultural surpluses, Egyptians specialized in different activities such as craftsmanship, trade, religion, and administration, laying the foundation of a highly organized society. At the same time, that order made it possible to recruit and sustain the hundreds or even thousands of workers needed to raise colossal structures. The pharaoh, the supreme ruler and a sacred figure, was seen as an intermediary between the gods and the people and was credited with almost divine powers. It is remarkable how complex a bureaucracy they developed to manage such a vast territory and to administer harvests, water distribution, and major architectural projects. Scribes trained in specialized schools were essential to this system and used hieroglyphic writing, a combination of ideographic and phonetic signs carved in stone or written on papyrus. This writing recorded administrative matters while also preserving myths and literary works, allowing modern scholars to reconstruct Egyptian worldviews, religious beliefs, and customs. Religion was a fundamental component of Egyptian life. It was a complex form of polytheism, with gods associated with natural phenomena such as the sun, fertility, and death. Among the main deities were Ra, the sun god who traveled across the sky in his solar boat, and Isis, a divine mother and protector worshipped throughout much of the land. Egypt's strategic location and wealth made it a target for powerful empires. Even so, it managed to preserve much of its cultural identity, despite invasions by the Assyrians and Persians. Alexander the Great arrived in Egyptian territory in 332 before Christ during his campaign against the Persian Empire. At that time, the Persians controlled the Nile Valley through garrisons and provincial governors, but the Egyptian population was not loyal to the Asian rulers. As Alexander and his Macedonian army advanced, Persian forces offered little resistance, and much of Egypt welcomed him as a liberator who put an end to years of foreign domination. From that point on, Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty, which blended local traditions with Greek influence and built Hellenistic-style cities while maintaining many native religious elements and rituals. Egyptian civilization, as an independent entity, came to an end with the defeat of the last Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra VII, by Rome in 30 before Christ. 4. Inca civilization. Developed during the 15th and 16th centuries of the Andean region of South America, it stretched from southern Colombia to parts of northern Chile and Argentina, with its core in what is now Peru. This civilization was defined by its system of social organization, known as Tahuantinsuyo, in which 4 great regions converged around Cusco, the capital. Its rulers, known as the Sapa Inca, exercised centralized control over the population, overseeing agricultural production, road construction, and the management of resources. Within the Cusco region, Machu Picchu stands as the most famous Inca settlement, built in the 15th century and attributed to the ruler of Pachacuti. It rises along the ridge of the mountain that bears its name. Architecturally, this site is flawlessly integrated into its natural surroundings, consisting of temples, palaces, and agricultural terraces designed with a complex hydraulic system that reflects the sophistication of Inca engineering. Ollantaytambo, located in the heart of the Sacred Valley of the Incas, functioned as a major political, military, and religious center. Notable features include its vast agricultural terraces carved into the mountain slopes, created to maximize food production in steep terrain. Dominating the town, the fortress served both as a defensive stronghold and a ceremonial site, with walls that reveal remarkable mastery in assembling enormous stone blocks. Situated on the upper edge of the city of Cusco, Sacsayhuaman is an imposing complex that astonished Spanish chroniclers with its monumental scale. While it is often described as a fortress, the site also fulfilled ceremonial purposes and symbolized Inca power and grandeur. Especially striking are its walls, built from massive stones carefully shaped to fit together with near-perfect precision. Transporting these gigantic stone blocks was done without draft animals or wheels, since the Incas did not use the wheel for heavy loads. It is believed that the stones were moved along roads and ramps using rolling logs, strong ropes, and the coordinated strength of large groups of people. Another impressive aspect lies in their understanding of astronomy, reflected in the alignment of certain sacred structures with celestial events. contact with Europe triggered a dramatic outcome. After the death of the Sapa Inca Huayna Capac, two of his heirs became locked in a brutal civil war that weakened the empire. Shortly afterward, Spanish forces led by Francisco Pizarro entered the region with horses and cannons, elements previously unknown to the local population. The shock of firearms, combined with diseases brought from the Old World, caused a rapid collapse. Entire villages fell to Spanish control, and the sacred temples were desecrated. According to tradition, during their retreat, the Incas withdrew into forests and mountains, leaving their cities exposed to encroaching vegetation. Over the generations that followed, many of their major settlements were gradually reclaimed by the jungle growth, disappearing from view from both locals and outsiders. Five, Maya civilization. It flourished in Mesoamerica around 2000 before Christ, spanning regions that today belong to Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. The cultural world was made up of multiple city-states, each with its own rulers and customs, connected by shared linguistic and religious traits. Located in the Petén region of northern present-day Guatemala, Tikal became one of the most populous Maya cities during the Classic period. Renowned for its towering temple pyramids, such as the Temple of the Great Jaguar, it also stood out for its vast urban layout surrounded by dense jungle. Serving as a political and religious center, the city maintained constant alliances and conflicts with other Maya kingdoms. Events recorded on monuments and stelae that document the history of its rulers. Situated in southeastern Campeche, Mexico, Calakmul thrived deep within the Maya rainforest and maintained an intense rivalry with Tikal. It is associated with the so-called Great Serpent in hieroglyphic text, a symbol of military and cultural power. Palenque, located in the Mexican state of Chiapas, reached its peak between the 7th and 8th centuries AD. Its architecture, featuring slender temples adorned with reliefs and hieroglyphic inscriptions, reflect a high level of artistic refinement. Among its most notable structures are the Temple of the Inscriptions, where the tomb of the ruler Pakal was discovered, and the palace, with its observation tower and elaborate carvings. Chichen Itza, in the northern Yucatan Peninsula, reached its height between the 9th and 13th centuries, blending local traditions with strong Toltec influences. Its main monument is El Castillo, also known as the Pyramid of Kukulkan, whose design reveals advanced astronomical knowledge, visible in the play of light and shadow during the equinoxes. The scientific achievements of the Maya were remarkable, especially in astronomy and mathematics. They developed an accurate calendar based on detailed observations of celestial bodies, along with a complex hieroglyphic writing system. Additionally, the Maya used the concept of zero in their calculations, a highly advanced idea that appeared in only a few ancient cultures. Several factors likely contributed to the Maya collapse: prolonged droughts that reduced the ability to sustain growing populations, internal conflicts and wars that destabilized kingdoms, and intensive farming practices that depleted the soil. Although many urban centers fell into decline, Maya culture did not disappear entirely. Groups in the northern region, particularly in Yucatan, continued to inhabit cities such as Chichen Itza and Mayapan during the post-classical period. Moreover, the Maya fiercely resisted Spanish conquest as it advanced during the 16th century. Some strongholds did not fall until the 17th century, when the last bastions were finally subdued. Nevertheless, millions of descendants still live in the region today, preserving their languages and cultural traditions. Six, Teotihuacan civilization. It emerged in the northeastern area of what is now the Valley of Mexico, consolidating between the 1st and 7th centuries AD. The main city, Teotihuacan, reached an enormous size for its time, eventually becoming one of the largest urban centers in the ancient world. At its height, it is estimated to have had tens of thousands of inhabitants, possibly exceeding 100,000, a striking figure when compared to other cities or the same era worldwide. The pyramids of the sun and the moon were its main ceremonial monuments. Both rose along the Avenue of the Dead, serving as focal points for religious and political life. The primary purpose of these pyramids was the performance of ceremonies tied to the Teotihuacan worldview, focused on ensuring agricultural fertility, renewing the cosmic cycle, and legitimizing political power. Priests and high-ranking figures carried out rituals involving offerings and sacrifices to honor deities linked to rain, farming, and warfare. In addition, the pyramids played a symbolic role in architectural landmarks, showcasing the greatness of Teotihuacan to visitors and envoys from other regions. In Teotihuacan, there was no advanced writing system comparable to that of the Maya, at least according to current archaeological evidence. Even so, its cultural influence on neighboring societies was profound. By the 7th century, certain neighborhoods and buildings began to be abandoned, while signs of internal conflict appeared. Struggles over resources and political rivalries may have ignited long-simmering tensions among different factions. Environmental factors also contributed, including possible disruptions to trade routes, soil erosion, and the overuse of agricultural land. After its collapse in the 7th century, the city was largely deserted, although pilgrims and scattered communities continued to visit the site to honor the gods or salvage reusable materials from the ruins. When the Aztecs encountered the remains of Teotihuacan centuries later, they named it the City of the Gods. 7. Nabateans. This civilization developed in the Arabian Peninsula and in regions that today correspond to Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Israel from the 4th century before Christ until the early 2nd century AD. It was characterized as a trading people who controlled caravan routes transporting spices, incense, and other highly valued goods in the ancient world. Rather than forming a classic expansionist empire, the Nabateans established a network of fortified settlements and cities that facilitated trade and protected merchandise. Their principal city was Petra, nestled within a rocky canyon and featuring buildings carved directly into sandstone cliffs. The treasury, Al-Khazna, and the monastery, Ad-Dir, continue to inspire awe with their dramatic facades, where columns and statues blend seamlessly with the reddish tones of the surrounding rock. Such achievements highlight Nabatean skill in engineering and architecture, as they devised precise methods for carving stone and channeling water into a harsh desert environment. They designed underground conduits and cisterns to collect scarce rainfall, ensuring the survival of their population. Managing water resources in such an arid climate still fascinates experts today. Mada in Salih, also known as Hegra, located in the northwestern present-day Saudi Arabia, was the second largest Nabatean settlement after Petra. It flourished as the Nabateans took advantage of the area's strategic position for trading spices, incense, and other goods. Rock formations there served as the foundation for carving dozens of monumental tombs, adorned with elaborate reliefs and finely crafted facades. Decline set in when Rome, seeking control over Mediterranean and Near Eastern trade routes, annexed Nabatean territory around the year 106 AD. The Nabatean trade network, essential to sustaining its economy, was gradually redirected towards other cities under Roman authority. Petra lost importance and was progressively abandoned as desert sands reclaimed its majestic rock-cut temples. For centuries, the ruins remained largely forgotten, occasionally visited by nomadic groups and a few travelers who spoke of a rose-colored city hidden within a canyon. '8. Minoan civilization. It originated on the island of Crete, located in the eastern Mediterranean, from around 3000 before Christ until approximately 1450 before Christ. Regarded as the first advanced culture in Europe, its name comes from the mythical king Minos, a figure associated with the legend of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth. Some scholars point out that Minoan trade networks reached Egypt, the Near East, and regions of the Aegean Sea, where ceramics, metals, and foodstuffs were exchanged. The construction of large palace complexes in places such as Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea astonished the first archaeologists who excavated the island. The Palace of Knossos, surrounded by myth, featured brightly colored frescoes on its walls. Its maze-like arrangement of buildings and corridors inspired the association with the legendary labyrinth where the Minotaur was said to dwell. Notably, most settlements lacked defensive walls, suggesting that during its peak there was no constant threat of invasion. Despite its prosperity, the Minoan civilization met an unexpected end. One leading theory attributes its decline to the volcanic eruption of the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, around 1600 before Christ. This eruption released vast amounts of ash and triggered a tsunami that struck the coast of Crete, damaging ports and agricultural areas. Coastal villages were left devastated, and ships, the economic backbone of the society, were rendered unusable. The loss of natural resources and the resulting disorganization likely triggered a crisis that brought an end to Minoan dominance in the Aegean Sea. Natural disaster was not the only threat. As Minoan power waned, the influence of mainland cultures, especially the Mycenaeans, began to grow. For a time, traces of Minoan tradition endured, but its essence was diminished, and the Palace of Knossos was reused for purposes different from its original role. Nine. Khmer Civilization, Angkor. It flourished in the Southeast Asia between the 9th and 15th centuries, in the region corresponding to present-day Cambodia and surrounding areas. Its rulers established a society organized around agriculture, religion, and an ambitious building program that transformed the landscape. The Khmer capital was the city of Angkor, located in what is now Siam Reap Province. Within this area, the political and ceremonial core was centered in Angkor Thom, founded in the late 12th century by King Jayavarman VII. Angkor Thom housed the royal palace, temples, and other administrative structures, while the broader Angkor complex included iconic monuments such as Angkor Wat and numerous other religious temples. Angkor Wat was built as both temple and administrative center, astonishing visitors and chroniclers with its sheer size and architectural detail. It represents the pinnacle of Khmer art and engineering, combining remarkable geometric precision with symbolic elements tied to Hindu and Buddhist cosmology. Angkor Thom, the fortified capital, contained the Bayon Temple, famous for its enigmatic towers carved with the serene stone faces. At its height, Angkor covered a larger area than many medieval European cities. Its inhabitants benefited from internal roads, markets, and districts specialized in crafts or production. Several rulers competed to surpass the achievements of their predecessors, building new temples or expanding the hydraulic networks. Despite such grandeur, the fall of Angkor unfolded tragically. By the 13th century, military tensions emerged with neighboring kingdoms, especially Ayutthaya in present-day Thailand, which advanced into Khmer territories. At the same time, instability in the monsoon cycle disrupted the delicate balance of the water management system. Prolonged droughts alternated with torrential rains, damaging reservoirs and dikes. Within a relatively short span, the ability to control water declined and rice production fell. The resulting famine likely triggered mass migrations and infrastructure decay. Temples once filled with worshippers became increasingly deserted. The final blow came with invasions and looting that dealt fatal strikes to central authority. The Khmer elite were forced to retreat or submit, and the capital was abandoned to the jungle, slowly swallowed by vegetation and oblivion. Centuries later, European travelers venturing into Cambodia heard rumors of colossal ruins hidden in the forest. These stories seemed almost mythical until 19th century explorers rediscovered Angkor, uncovering partially ruined temples that confirmed its once glorious past. Nazca Civilization. It developed in the southern coastal region of present-day Peru, in the valleys of the Nazca and Pisco rivers between 100 before Christ and 700 of our era. The territory is defined by an extremely arid climate and poor soils, which forced the Nazca people to display great creativity in order to thrive. Their settlements were concentrated near seasonal rivers and in areas where they built canal systems to tap into underground water sources. Social organization combined agricultural practices with religious and ceremonial life, reflecting a tight-knit society that was highly dependent on the fragile environment around it. The fame of this culture comes from the lines and geoglyphs etched into the dry plain, where striking animal figures and vast geometric designs can be seen. Among the most recognizable are the hummingbird, the monkey, the spider, the condor, and the so-called astronaut, all traced with remarkable precision. These geoglyphs are believed to have had ceremonial or religious purposes that may have been part of rituals linked to water, a vital element for their survival. The desert's dry climate and lack of strong winds have preserved these lines almost unchanged for centuries. Regarding architecture, the Puquillos deserve special mention. A network of underground canals and aqueducts used to bring water from subterranean streams to farming areas. Such a hydraulic system reveals a significant level of technological advancement, especially given the region's extreme aridity, and its upkeep would have required strong collective organization. The decline of the Nazca civilization occurred around the 7th century, when many of its settlements were abandoned within a relatively short period of time. Several theories point to prolonged droughts of sudden floods that destroyed the delicate underground canals essential for irrigation. As farmland became unusable, the population likely dispersed, in some cases migrating to other, more stable valleys. Rapa Nui. The Rapa Nui people inhabited the remote Easter Island, located in the Pacific Ocean, far off the coast of Chile. This Polynesian culture arrived by canoe around the 13th century, bringing with it traditions, social organization, and a religion centered on deified ancestors. The island landscape, despite being small and isolated, became the setting for a society that raised colossal statues known as moai. Carved from volcanic rock, these statues were transported using techniques that still raise questions today. Possibilities include the use of wooden sleds, ropes, or clever rocking motion to move them. The figures display elongated faces and torsos that often appear to emerge only partially from the ground. Seen together, they convey the solemn character of a culture focused on honoring ancestors, believed to protect the community and ensure the fertility of the land. The Rapa Nui also developed a system of inscriptions known as Rongo Rongo, whose full meaning has yet to be deciphered. One unsettling aspect is how the same society ultimately exhausted its own resources. Easter Island was once covered with palm forests, used for agriculture, transporting the moai, and building canoes. Over time, intensive logging and the lack of regeneration led to near-total deforestation, causing erosion, food shortages, and internal tensions. Different factions fought for control, and scholars believe a social collapse followed, marked by episodes of violence and the destruction of the rival moai. The turmoil was so severe that even before Europeans arrived, the civilization was already weakened and had abandoned its large ritual constructions. From that point on, the remaining cultural traces entered a kind of stagnation until foreign explorers arrived in the 18th century. The island was named Easter Island after the Dutch expedition led by Jacob Roggeveen, who landed there on Easter Sunday in 1722. They encountered a land dotted with silent stone figures and inhabitants struggling with precarious survival. Over the centuries, Western scientists and travelers returned, documenting the half-buried moai and leaving written accounts of what they found. (12) Roman civilization. It began along the banks of the Tiber River on the Italian peninsula around 800 before Christ, when a group of villages united to form what would become one of the most influential civilizations of the ancient world. In its early stages, Rome was a kingdom ruled by monarchs of both local lineage and Etruscan influence. Over time, that small rural community evolved into a vast republican system, and later into a powerful empire that spanned territories across Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Romans established an organizational model with highly developed institutions. Citizens took part in public life, whether during the Republic, through the Senate and popular assemblies, or under the Empire, where authority was concentrated in the emperor. This administrative structure supported military campaigns that expanded Roman borders from Britain to the Euphrates. At the height of its power, Rome ruled over millions of people in an area of continental scale, creating an unprecedented political, economic, and cultural network around the Mediterranean. Rome's architectural legacy continues to inspire awe. The Romans built roads that connected distant provinces, allowing the efficient movement of legions, goods, and travelers. They also constructed bridges, aqueducts, and monumental buildings designed to showcase the greatness of imperial power. The Colosseum, inaugurated in the 1st century of our era, hosted spectacles featuring gladiators and exotic animals before tens of thousands of spectators. Another standout is the Pantheon, whose interior preserves a concrete dome that remained an engineering marvel for centuries, as it was built without internal pillars to support the roof. Such construction skill relied on the development of strong, long-lasting concrete, whose formulas included volcanic ash. Roman law, known as Roman law, had a profound influence on later legal systems and served as a foundation for legal codes in many countries. By the 3rd century, the city of Rome itself was home to nearly 1 million inhabitants, a population size Europe would not see again until the rise of major metropolises many centuries later. However, this vastness concealed internal tensions, social inequity, and the early signs of a decline that would intensify over generations. Pressure from Germanic tribes and the Huns, economic crises, the rising cost of maintaining armies on multiple fronts, and political instability all contributed to growing uncertainty. In addition, low birth rates within the empire are believed to have played a role. Some historians argue that elite Roman preferences shifted, especially in the later centuries, toward comfort and urban lifestyles. This shortage of children among the Roman elite was noted by contemporary authors such as Polybius, who as early as the 2nd century before Christ warned that wealthy families were having fewer offspring. In the final phase of the empire, military recruitment became increasingly difficult due to the declining number of availability of Roman citizens for its service. When the great invasions of the 5th century arrived, the social fabric was already worn thin. Hordes of Goths and Vandals moved through lands that once had been secure. While Roman legions struggled to hold their ground, prosperous cities turned into scenes of panic and abandonment. In the year 410, Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome itself, a moral shock that stunned the entire Mediterranean world, long accustomed to viewing the city as inviolable. Later, the Vandals attacked the capital again, deepening fear and uncertainty. Despite these clear signs of disintegration, the Western Roman Empire maintained a formal existence until 476, when the last emperor, Romulus Augustus, was deposed by Odoacer. That moment symbolized the culmination of a decline that could no longer be stopped. Many inhabitants must have felt a profound sense of loss at the fall of the imperial institution that had provided unity and stability for centuries. Roads fell into disrepair in several regions, trade declined, and Latin, though it endured, began to fragment into what would later become the Romance languages. The Eastern Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, survived until 1453, although its character had already diverged significantly from that of the Western Empire. (13) Persian civilization. It originated on the Iranian Plateau, a region lying between mountains and deserts where Indo-European tribes had settled long before. These people, known as the Persians, gradually organized themselves into different dynasties, but it was under the Achaemenid family, around the 6th century before Christ, that one of the most formidable empires of the ancient world emerged. Cyrus II, also known as Cyrus the Great, expanded his rule from present-day Iran to Asia Minor, Egypt, and parts of Central Asia, creating a vast political entity that encompassed a wide diversity of languages and religions. To govern efficiently, he established satrapies, or provinces, entrusted to local nobles who answered directly to him. This decentralized model was unusual compared to other empires of the time and encouraged relatively harmonious coexistence. Persepolis, the grand ceremonial city built by Darius I and continued by Xerxes and other monarchs, featured palaces with towering columns, stone reliefs depicting tributes from different regions, and stairways leading to halls where the great king received his subjects. On its walls appeared scenes of lions and bulls, human figures dressed in regional attire, and floral motifs that conveyed the diversity of the empire. A defining trait was the so-called Persian tolerance. Rulers allowed conquered peoples to preserve their gods and customs. Cyrus II became famous for permitting the Jewish people to return to their land and rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem, an event with lasting religious significance. In addition, the Persians adopted astronomical and medical knowledge from Mesopotamia and Egypt, blending it into a body of learning that influenced later civilizations. They also promoted the minting of coinage, inspired by kingdoms in Asia Minor, and in the use of standardized currency helped stimulate international trade. Despite its strength, Persian civilization experienced dramatic turning points. One well-known episode was the conflict with the Greeks, including Xerxes' defeat in the Greco-Persian Wars. Although this damaged royal prestige, the empire endured for some time afterward. The true catastrophe came in the 4th century before Christ, when Alexander the Great launched his campaign of conquest. After decisively defeating Darius III at battles such as Issus and Gaugamela, Macedonian forces advanced relentlessly through cities and palaces. They set Persepolis ablaze, destroying treasures and works of art. That moment marked the end of the Persian Empire. Ancient Greece. It emerged gradually after the decline of Mycenaean culture around the 12th century before Christ and lasted until its territories were absorbed into Roman power around 2nd century before Christ. Throughout this long span, Greek populations settled in the Balkan Peninsula, the Aegean Islands, and numerous colonies spread across the Mediterranean from Asia Minor to southern Italy. Although they did not form a single unified state for most of their history, they shared a common language, religious beliefs, and a strong identity rooted in mythology and participation in festivals such as the Olympic Games. That competitive spirit expressed itself in military, cultural, and athletic arenas, shaping a world of city-states like Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and Corinth, each with its own system of government and customs. Their buildings were often located in sacred precincts and on the Acropolis of each polis. Athens, for instance, erected the monumental Parthenon complex with Doric columns and sculpted panels dedicated to the goddess Athena. polished marble, finely carved reliefs, and harmonious proportions captivated travelers in both ancient and modern times. Elsewhere, temples, theaters, and stadiums were constructed, reflecting the high value placed on religion and public life. At the Theater of Epidaurus, famous for its flawless acoustics, tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were performed, exploring fate, justice, and the relationship between humans and the gods. One of the most striking aspects of Greek civilization was its level of intellectual advancement. Philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle laid the foundations of ethical, political, and scientific thought that still guide Western philosophy. Research in geometry, astronomy, and medicine was carried out by figures such as Pythagoras, Hipparchus, and Hippocrates, who developed methods based on observation and empirical reasoning. The Greek alphabet, adapted from Phoenician, made it possible to compose literary works preserved to this day, including Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, whose influence spans many cultures. Moreover, political science found a remarkable experiment in Athens: democracy, a system of citizen participation that was revolutionary for its time. After the Greco-Persian Wars, in which the Greeks repelled Persian invasion, the city-states soon turned against one another in the Peloponnesian War. This conflict drained resources and weakened the cities, paving the way for the rise of Macedonia under Philip II and his son, Alexander the Great. The final loss of independence came with Roman conquest from 146 before Christ onward. Rome imposed protectorate over Greece, and successive annexations eventually turned the region into a province of the empire. Aristocrats and scholars attempted to defend their sovereignty, but treaties of submission and Roman armies proved overwhelming. Over time, some temples and public buildings fell into ruin, victims of neglect, natural disasters, or looting by those who reused their stones for new constructions. '15. Sumerians. It emerged in the region of Mesopotamia, in the area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, modern-day southern Iraq, around 4,500 before Christ. Its most important cities include Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Eridu. These urban cities grew under the influence of a culture that developed irrigation systems and writing to an exceptional degree. Among their achievements, cuneiform writing stands out as one of the earliest writing systems in history. It first appeared to keep accounts and record commercial transactions, but over time it expanded to include religious, literary, and administrative texts. In addition, Sumerian society created complex political structures, led by priest-kings who ruled from massive temples known as ziggurats. These structures were step towers that dominated the city skyline and reflected both architectural ambition and a spiritual connection with their deities. In the scientific realm, they introduced numerical systems based on the number 60, which became the foundation for timekeeping and degrees in geometry. In astronomy, although they did not reach the precision of later periods, They took early steps in observing celestial bodies and linking astronomical events to religious festivals or rituals. Their temples were not only spiritual centers, but also hubs for administration and grain storage. Some of the main Sumerian deities include Anu, the father of the gods and god of the sky; Enlil, god of air, atmosphere, and winds; Enki, god of fresh water, wisdom, and magic; and Inanna, goddess of love, fertility, and war. That blend of the divine and the political created a powerful elite responsible for organizing construction projects and managing the resources of each city-state. The very autonomy of each city led to rivalries that planted the seeds of conflict. Every city fought to secure the best irrigation lands to trade routes, and mutual distrust produced a landscape of recurring wars. The beginning of decline came when river systems started to shift their courses, and in part due to agricultural practices that reduced soil fertility. Moreover, internal tensions were compounded by the arrival of new people eager to occupy this coveted region. Over the centuries, Amorite invaders settled in the area, took political control, and founded new city-states such as the dynasty that ruled Babylon. Armies moving through the region ignored traditional boundaries, and harvests became spoils of war. Ultimately, Sumerian culture faded after successive conquests and the gradual adoption of foreign language, such as Akkadian. Although their writing and memories survived on clay tablets, Sumer's independent identity disappeared, leaving behind ruins and myths that inspired later Mesopotamian peoples. (16) Indus Valley Civilization. Also known as the Harappan culture, after one of its main archaeological sites, it developed between 3,300 before Christ and 1,300 before Christ in territories that today belong to Pakistan and northwestern India. It spread across a region even larger than Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt, making it one of the largest and most enigmatic civilizations in the ancient world. Its cities and villages grew along the Indus and Gugur-Hakra rivers, taking advantage of seasonal flooding for agriculture and trade. The principal settlements were Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, cities that continued to amaze researchers with their urban planning and advanced infrastructure for the time. They featured straight streets laid out in a grid pattern, along with drainage and sewage systems that would not be matched in any parts of the world until centuries or even millennia later. At Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists uncovered public baths built with waterproof bricks and carefully designed water tanks, reflecting sophisticated hydraulic engineering. What is striking is that despite their complex society, there is little clear evidence of grand palaces or monumental temples like those found in Mesopotamia or Egypt. This has led scholars to suggest that political organization may have been less centralized, or that administrative buildings were integrated discreetly into the urban fabric, rather than standing out as imposing monuments. Another remarkable aspect of this civilization is its writing system. Hundreds of seals and tablets have been found bearing inscriptions in a set of symbols that remained undeciphered. The collapse of this civilization remains a mystery that researchers attempt to unravel through various clues. One theory points to climate change that may have altered river courses or reduced monsoon rainfall, making agriculture and water supply more difficult. Other explanations involve natural disasters such as earthquakes or catastrophic floods that damage cities, as well as possible invasions by people from neighboring regions. It is likely that no single factor acted alone, but rather a combination of internal and external crises that led to the gradual abandonment of major cities and the dispersal of the population into rural areas. Over time, the heirs of Harappan culture likely adopted new forms of organization and blended with other groups, causing much of the memory of what had once been one of the most impressive civilizations of the Bronze Age to fade away. Phoenicians. They flourished along the coastal strip of the Levant, in what is now Lebanon and parts of Syria and Israel. Their peak extended roughly from 1200 before Christ to 539 before Christ, when they fell under Persian rule. These people were organized into city-states such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, each with its own government and fleet, yet united by a shared language and culture. Unlike large territorial empires, the Phoenicians stood out for their maritime and commercial activity, establishing routes across the Mediterranean that reached as far as the Atlantic Ocean. Their skill in building sturdy wooden ships and navigating waters previously little explored was one of their defining traits. Thanks to this mastery of seafaring, they founded colonies and trading posts in different places, such as Sardinia, Sicily, and the Iberian Peninsula. One of these foundations, Carthage, eventually became a major power in its own right and a direct heir to the Phoenician tradition. Along their coastal cities, they built highly sophisticated ports and temples dedicated to deities such as Baal and Astarte. Although they did not raise pyramids or monumental palaces like other cultures, the design of docks and coastal fortifications required advanced knowledge of naval and military engineering. A truly transformative achievement was the invention of the phonetic alphabet that laid the groundwork for later writing systems, including Greek and Latin. This innovation simplified trade and communication, making it easier to record transactions and contracts. Yet Phoenician prosperity did not last forever. The rise of military powers and growing commercial competition intensified over the generations, and Assyrians and Babylonians attacked Phoenician cities in search of tribute. In 539 before Christ, the Persian king Cyrus the Great occupied these cities and incorporated them into his empire. Although they retained some autonomy for trade, they no longer possessed the independent power that had once defined them. The final strain came with the expansion of Alexander the Great in the 4th century before Christ, when he conquered Tyre after a brutal siege. Walls thought to be invincible were breached by war machines, and the city fell after fierce fighting. That episode marked the definitive end of Phoenician civilization, as such, which gradually dissolved under Hellenistic influence and later Roman domination. '18. Ancient China. It took shape in the basins of the Yellow River and the Yangtze River in Eastern Asia, bringing together a succession of dynasties that ruled for nearly 3,000 years. Its beginnings are often placed in the legendary Xia dynasty around 2,000 years before Christ, although the earliest archaeological evidence corresponds to the Shang dynasty, which emerged around 1600 before Christ. Over time, other powerful dynasties arose, such as the Zhou, Qin, and Han, solidifying these cultural, political, and philosophical foundations of what we now recognize as Chinese civilization. These societies settled around fertile river valleys that allowed them to develop stable agriculture based mainly on rice and millet cultivation. Such abundance of resources made possible the rise of large walled cities, bronze workshops, and other industries that reflected a high degree of organization. Among the achievements of ancient China are the invention of gunpowder, paper, printing, and the compass, advances that transformed not only Chinese society, but centuries later, much of the rest of the world. They also perfected the production of silk, a process that required careful tending of silkworms and the extraction of extremely fine threads, later woven into luxurious fabrics. These products fueled vast trade routes, most famously the Silk Road, which linked the region of Central Asia and Europe, encouraging the exchange of exotic goods, religious ideas, and scientific knowledge. One of the most recognizable monuments of this civilization is the Great Wall, a structure built in stages beginning with the Qin dynasty and expanded over centuries to protect northern borders from nomadic incursions. Although it's not a single continuous wall, the combined length of its segments forms an immense system of walls, watchtowers, and fortified passes. It is astonishing to imagine the effort required to transport stone and bricks to remote mountainous regions where workers labored under extremely harsh conditions. Over the centuries, the political and social structures of ancient China faced repeated challenges from internal rebellions, famines, power struggles, and external pressure from neighboring peoples. The influence of major dynasties, such as the Han, eventually gave way to new rulers, and periods of unity alternated with times of fragmentation. In later centuries, the imperial model preserved ancient features while also introducing new elements. Ultimately, the accumulation of internal crises, tensions, and foreign powers, and economic transformation led to the fall of the last dynasty, the Qing, in 1912. That millennia-old empire was replaced by modern political structures, leaving traditional forms of rule behind and opening the door to social and political revolutions that would reshape China's future. '19. Babylonian civilization. It occupied the central region of Mesopotamia along the banks of the Euphrates River from around 1900 before Christ until 539 before Christ in what is now modern-day Iraq. This civilization emerged from the ancient city-state of Babylon, which rose to prominence after the decline of Sumer and the Akkadian Empire. Its rulers unified the surrounding territory and imposed administrative systems that consolidated a prosperous kingdom. Over the centuries, Babylon became a major cultural and political center, reaching particular fame during the reign of Hammurabi and later during the Neo-Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar II. The Babylonians constructed remarkable structures, most notably their fortified walls and the legendary Ishtar Gate, decorated with reliefs and fantastical armies and deities. There is also the tradition of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, although no definitive evidence of their exact location has been found. Religious devotion was expressed through ziggurats, stepped towers where ceremonies were performed in honor of the gods, especially Marduk, the chief deity of the city. One of the most significant achievements of Babylonian civilization was its contribution to law, embodied in the Code of Hammurabi, carved into the basalt stele. This code contains nearly 282 legal provisions regulating commercial transactions, marriage, and compensation for damages, reflecting a society deeply concerned with order and justice. In the scientific sphere, the Babylonians compiled astronomical and mathematical knowledge, refining the sexagesimal system inherited from the Sumerians and recording observations of the sky on clay tablets. The decline of Babylon began with the death of its strongest kings and the emergence of new threats in the region. In 539 before Christ, Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, entered Babylon with little resistance. Over time, its buildings fell into disrepair, and the city lost its importance as a center of power. Across the centuries, desert sands gradually covered the ruins of Babylon, leaving behind only accounts in Greek chronicles and biblical texts that recalled its former greatness. Olmec civilization. It developed along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, mainly in what are now the states of Veracruz and Tabasco, from approximately 1500 before Christ to around 400 before Christ. Often regarded as the mother culture of Mesoamerica, it influenced later societies such as the Maya and Zapotec. Its most important settlements were San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes, which functioned as ceremonial and political centers governed by elites who led rituals tied to a complex religious system. Among its most striking features are the colossal stone heads carved from massive basalt blocks. With their unmistakable facial features, they are believed to represent rulers or figures endowed with semi-divine status. In the fields of astronomy and timekeeping, the Olmecs developed calendrical systems and symbolic elements that may have been seen as precursors to later writing systems in the region. It is believed that their knowledge of agriculture and irrigation allowed them to sustain large communities within a dense jungle environment. Trade routes carried Olmec influence to distant areas, spreading artistic styles and religious ideas. By around 400 before Christ, the network of ceremonial cities declined for reasons that remain unclear. Some scholars point to climatic changes and shifts in the rivers that supplied the settlements, while others suggest internal conflicts or external pressure from neighboring peoples. Aztecs. Also known as the Mexica, this civilization emerged in the central highlands of what is now Mexico, reaching its height between the 14th and 16th centuries. Their origins trace back to groups migrating from the north who settled in the basin of Mexico, guided by a legend that foretold finding an eagle perched on a cactus while devouring a snake. That sign marked the place where they were to found their capital, Tenochtitlan, in the year 1325. Over nearly 2 centuries, the Aztecs consolidated political and military power, forming a triple alliance with the cities of Texcoco and Tlacopan. Although they did not establish a centralized empire in the European sense, they subdued numerous peoples and demanded tribute in the form of food, precious feathers, textiles, and other goods. Tenochtitlan was a vast city that stunned first-time visitors with its scale and sophistication. Some European chroniclers compared it to the grandest city of their own continent, and the comparison was justified. It housed hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. Some estimates suggest around 200,000, an extraordinary figure for the time, even by European standards. Broad causeways led into the central plaza, a bustling space where merchants, artisans, and nobles mingled under the watchful eyes of priests and feathered warriors. Within this metropolis, political authority was headed by the Huey Tlatoani, the supreme ruler, chosen by a council of nobles and priests. He led military campaigns to subdue rival groups or reinforce alliances, while also overseeing tribute collection and religious affairs. Priests, for their part, governed ceremonial life, kept track of the calendar, and organized sacrifices that, according to their beliefs, nourished the gods and ensured the sun would continue its daily journey. The Aztecs practiced what was known as flower wars to capture prisoners destined for sacrifice, believing that human offerings preserved cosmic balance and sustained the solar cycle. Historical accounts describe ceremonies in which still-beating hearts were offered to the gods atop towering pyramids. At the same time, their advanced knowledge was evident in astronomy and their pictographic writing system. Priests responsible for the calendar recorded ritual cycles, sacred counts, and political events in codices. When the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés arrived in Aztec territory in 1519, the fate of this civilization entered a decisive phase. By forging alliances with enemies of the Aztecs, the Spaniards ignited a brutal conflict. Smallpox and other diseases brought from Europe also ravaged the native population, causing massive deaths that weakened resistance. Ultimately, Tenochtitlan fell in 1521 under a siege in which the causeways were blocked and Aztec canoes proved no match for firearms and horses, both unknown to them. With the Spanish conquest, the remains of ancient Tenochtitlan were buried beneath a new colonial city, Mexico City. For centuries, the metropolis expanded without full awareness of the Aztec foundations hidden below. (22) Zapotecs. This civilization developed in the central valleys of what is now the state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico. Its history dates back to around 500 before Christ and lasted until roughly the 15th century, when Aztec expansion of the arrival of Spanish conquerors marked a turning point. The flagship city of this culture was Monte Alban. Perched atop a mountain, it became the capital and religious heart of the Zapotecs for much of their golden age. Choosing such an elevated site was no coincidence. From this vantage point, one could visually dominate the convergence of the three central valleys, offering clear strategic advantages. Its urban layout reveals a ceremonial design with broad plazas, stepped pyramids, and palaces that reflect strict planning. Religious and institutional priorities were expressed through the worship of gods associated with rain and fertility, as well as deities linked to warfare. Economic life relied on the cultivation of corn, beans, and squash, supported by the fertile valley soils. And agricultural surpluses sustained trade networks that reached from the Pacific coast to more remote mountainous regions. From the 9th century onward, the growing influence of other regional powers, such as the Mixtecs and later Aztecs, gradually reduced Zapotec dominance. By the 15th century, Aztec pressure and interregional conflicts had fragmented many Zapotec cities. The arrival of the Spaniards in the 16th century delivered the final blow, imposing colonial structures and forcibly transforming traditional ways of life. Sacred lands were converted into estates, and temples fell into ruin or were replaced by churches. Accounts suggest that the last Zapotec leaders endured a tense period of adjustment under Spanish rule, while ancestral customs retreated into more isolated communities. (23) Anasazi people. Also known as the ancestral plebeians, this culture developed in the Four Corners regions of the southwestern United States, where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, between the year 100 and 1300. Their way of life balanced farming, hunting, and gathering, with communities established in canyons and arid-looking plateaus. Over time, these societies demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt to an environment marked by extreme temperatures and limited rainfall. They settled in places such as the Chaco Canyon, Merced Verde, and other areas of the Colorado Plateau, where they cultivated corn, beans, and squash. Using stone foundations and carefully shaped walls, they built large, multi-story residential complexes known as pueblos, often including underground ceremonial chambers called kivas. Among the most notable Anasazi structures is Pueblo Bonita, located in Chaco Canyon. It consists of hundreds of rooms arranged around a central courtyard. Stone blocks were fitted together with impressive precision, creating imposing walls that rose several stories high. Across vast distances and dusty pathways, the Anasazi established trade routes that connected them with far-off regions. Another striking feature of their culture was their astronomical knowledge. Evidence suggests that certain buildings were aligned with solstices or equinoxes, indicating close observation of seasonal cycles, essential for farming in such dry lands. In their own way, the Anasazi were water engineers. They developed simple canals and reservoirs to capture rainfall, allowing crops to survive in a landscape with few natural wetlands. As generations passed, new settlements were built into cliffs and natural rock shelters, such as the famous cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, partly to defend against external threats or to seek protection from the elements. These stone homes embedded in cliffs convey the image of a society capable of mastering a seemingly hostile environment, though they may also reflect rising insecurity and conflict. The period of decline began around year 1300, when several destructive factors converged. Archaeological studies point to prolonged droughts that reduced water supplies and severely affected food production. Compounding this, the overuse of forests for fuel and construction led to erosion and the depletion of vital resources. Some theories also suggest disputes between clans or outbreaks of internal violence. Faced with scarcity and mounting tension, Anasazi communities chose to migrate. Many moved towards areas near the Colorado River or the Rio Grande Valley, where groups such as the Hopi and Zuni regard them as ancestors. For centuries, places once filled with ceremonies and gatherings fell into silence. All that remained were solitary stone walls and fragments of pottery hidden among the brush. '24. Toltecs. This civilization arose in the central region of what is now Mexico, where its main center is the city of Tula. Its peak is generally dated between the 9th and 12th centuries, following the decline of Teotihuacan and serving as a cultural bridge toward the Aztecs. While they never formed an empire as vast as those of the Aztecs or Maya, the Toltecs left a strong architectural and religious legacy that shaped regional worldviews and lived on through legends passed down over generations. Tula's urban core stood out for its layout of plazas and temples arranged around pyramid bases. One of its most striking features is the so-called Atlanteans of Tula. massive stone columns carved from volcanic rock that depict warriors or deities adorned with military gear. Each of these towering figures watches over the ancient pyramid, evoking a past in which warfare and religion were deeply intertwined. Archaeologists suggest that Tula may have supported a sizable population, though likely smaller than cities such as Teotihuacan at their height. To sustain life in this semi-arid region, inhabitants relied on efficient terrace farming and trade networks that supplied valuable raw materials from neighboring areas. They also produced finely decorated polychrome technology, often depicting gods, warriors, or scenes from daily life. Obsidian, essential for making blades and tools, was actively traded. Several theories propose that Tula suffered from internal conflicts, possibly succession struggles or disputes between religious and military factions. External pressure from nomadic groups known as the Chichimeca may have worsened these tensions. Once these conflicts reached a breaking point, the civilization collapsed. Tula was abandoned, and its structures were gradually overtaken by vegetation. '25. Etruscans. They thrived on the Italian peninsula, covering what is now known as Tuscany, northern Latium, and part of Umbria, from the 8th century before Christ to the 1st century before Christ. Over time, they became one of the most influential cultures of pre-Roman Italy, expanding into the Po Valley and establishing prosperous city-states known as Leucomenes, which maintained relationships marked by both cooperation and rivalry. Access to the Mediterranean through ports, along with a strategic position on major land routes, encouraged trade in metals, grain, wine, and pottery. This exchange also fostered the adoption of Greek and Eastern influences, visible in painted ceramics, goldsmithing, and certain religious practices. Etruscans also developed their own language and writing system, derived from the Greek alphabet, although much of their written record has been lost or remains difficult to interpret due to the scarcity of long inscriptions. In religious life, they practiced divination by examining animal livers and observing celestial phenomena in order to interpret divine will. They likewise adopted from the Greeks the custom of holding banquets in which men and women participated together, something that struck other cultures of the Italian peninsula as unusual or even shocking. From the 4th century before Christ onward, the Roman Republic gradually subdued the Etruscan cities, either through direct military conquest or by integrating their ruling elites. During the Middle Ages, their ruins lay hidden beneath soil and vegetation. Their existence was remembered mainly through references by Latin authors who described the Etruscans as religiously sophisticated, yet ultimately overwhelmed by Roman expansion. '26. Carthaginians. This civilization arose in North Africa, along the coast of what is now Tunisia. According to tradition, it was founded around 814 before Christ when Phoenician settlers from Tyre arrived and established an exceptional natural harbor. At its height, Carthaginian control extended across several islands of the western Mediterranean, as well as coastal territories on the Iberian Peninsula and parts of southern Italy. The capital, also called Carthage, emerged as a port of extraordinary importance, built on a peninsula surrounded by calm waters. It featured a dual harbor system, one dedicated to commerce and the other reserved for military use. Carthaginians inherited from their Phoenician ancestors a strong tradition of seafaring and trade. This led them to establish extensive maritime routes reaching the Iberian Peninsula, where they founded settlements such as Gadir, modern-day Cadiz, as well as the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, and Sicily. Their ships crossed the Mediterranean carrying silver, tin, salt, and a wide range of goods. At the same time, Carthaginian religion preserved Phoenician elements, worshiping deities such as Baal, Hammon, and Tanit, sometimes through rituals that included sacrifices. Conflict with Rome ultimately shaped the fate of this civilization. The so-called Punic Wars were a series of brutal confrontations, the most famous being the Second Punic War, when the general Hannibal led his legendary march across the Pyrenees and the Alps with war elephants to surprise Rome on its own soil. Although he achieved spectacular victories, Hannibal failed to capture Rome. Eventually, Roman forces counterattacked in Africa and forced Carthage into a humiliating peace, followed by years of resentment and tension. During the Third Punic War, Roman armies invaded the city determined to erase it completely. A brutal siege destroyed its walls and homes, burned as defenders fought desperately in the streets. According to tradition, fire consumed the city, and in a symbolic act of cruelty or propaganda, Rome scattered salt over the surrounding fields to prevent agriculture. Thus, in 146 before Christ, the definitive fall of Carthage was sealed. '27. Terona. They inhabited the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta region on Colombia's north coast from the 8th to the 16th century. Settling among valleys and steep mountain slopes, they took advantage of rivers flowing down to the Caribbean Sea. From an early stage, they developed terrace agriculture, growing corn, cassava, beans, and other crops that formed the foundation of their livelihood. Deep within the dense mountain forest, the most emblematic Teronian city was Tayuna, known today as the Lost City. It is believed to have reached its peak between the 11th and 14th centuries, at a time when it may have housed thousands of inhabitants. Built along the mountainside, it featured a complex system of terraces, retaining walls, stone-paved paths, and channels designed to manage water flow. Homes, mostly made of wood and organic materials, stood on circular stone platforms that remain visible today. Urban planning suggests a clear social hierarchy, with ceremonial plazas and elite residences located on higher levels. Spiritual leaders, possibly shamans, acted as intermediaries with the deities and were responsible for maintaining harmony between the community and the natural environment. This social and religious order was shaken in the 16th century with the arrival of Spanish conquistadors. Native resistance was fierce, yet the impact of European diseases, the brutality of military campaigns, and the disruption of food networks ultimately fractured the society. Accounts describe how the Tairona fled to increasingly high remote areas to escape Spanish control. Over the decades, the population was decimated, and many mountain cities were abandoned, swallowed by dense vegetation and silence. '28. Kingdom of Axum. It was one of the most influential civilizations in northeastern Africa, developing between the 1st and 7th centuries. Its territory covered what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, extending its reach along the Red Sea into parts of southern Arabia. At its height, Axum was recognized as one of the great powers of the ancient world, even mentioned by Roman authors as one of the 4 major civilizations of its time, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. The capital of the Kingdom of Axum served as the political, religious, and cultural heart of the civilization. Located on a fertile plateau, it featured impressive structures and functioned as a major trade hub linking Africa with Asia and Europe. Within the city stood massive monolithic stelae, or obelisks, carved from single blocks of granite. These marked royal tombs and symbolized the power and spiritual beliefs of the kingdom. Thanks to their strategic position near the Red Sea, the Axumites traded gold, ivory, spices, and hides with regions as distant as the Roman Empire, Persia, and India. Notably, Axum was among the first of the African civilizations to mint coins bearing inscriptions in both Greek and Ge'ez, the local language, highlighting its role as a cultural bridge between worlds. In the religious sphere, the Kingdom of Axum reached a major milestone during the reign of King Ezana in the 4th century when it converted to Christianity. This transformation made it one of the first states to officially adopt the faith long before many regions of Europe did so. Like all great civilizations, Axum eventually faced decline. Beginning in the 7th century, the spread of Islam across the Arabian Peninsula and the Red Sea coast shifted trade routes towards the Persian Gulf, severely damaging the Axumite economy. As control over key ports weakened, international commerce dropped sharply, cutting off the revenues that had sustained its prosperity. At the same time, pressure from neighboring peoples and the exhaustion of agricultural resources in the core territory worsened the crisis. By the 8th century, Axum had lost much of its power, and the capital was gradually abandoned. Prolonged droughts and soil erosion contributed to the collapse of agricultural production, forcing populations to migrate in search of more secure areas. '29. Assyria. Assyria developed from around 2500 before Christ until 609 before Christ in northern Mesopotamia along the Tigris River, where cities such as Ashur, Nineveh, and Kalhu, Nimrud, rose to prominence over the centuries. Its rulers were famous for the discipline of their armies, which used iron weapons and advanced siege techniques. The soldiers' ability to build ramps and deploy assault machines had a devastating impact on enemy fortresses. Reliefs and sculptures depicted winged genies and protective deities seemingly guarding the walls, while images of lions and winged bulls adorned entrances, reinforcing the sense of sacred and royal space. They relied on well-built roads and messengers who traveled long distances on horseback, ensuring that political and military decisions were communicated swiftly across the empire. Kings encouraged the use of clay tablets written in cuneiform, recording legal documents, treaties, commercial matters, and detailed accounts of wars. Despite this strength, collapse came when a coalition of peoples opposed to Assyrian dominance, including the Chaldeans and Medes, attacked the major cities toward the end of the 7th century before Christ. Nineveh's walls eventually fell after a prolonged siege, and palaces burned as the population tried to flee or resist in vain. The flames consumed archives and sculptures that represented centuries of splendor. After the destruction of its main centers, the Assyrian Empire ceased to exist, and many of its people merged with other populations, losing their political identity. 30. Akkadians. The Akkadians emerged in ancient Mesopotamia in what is now mainly Iraq around the millennium before Christ. They are considered to have founded the first empire in Mesopotamian history, unifying territories that had previously been divided into independent city-states. Their center of power was the city of Akkad, also called Agade, whose exact location has not been definitively identified by modern archaeology, though contemporary sources describe it as a dynamic and highly influential city. At its height, the empire flourished under the reign of Sargon of Akkad, who subdued regions stretching from the Persian Gulf into northern Mesopotamia, creating an administrative system that brought formerly autonomous cities under centralized control. Although they inherited much from Sumerian culture, the Akkadians stood out for their use of the Akkadian language, of Semitic origin, which soon became the official language of bureaucracy and diplomacy. Through their campaigns, they controlled key trade routes across Mesopotamia, allowing them to obtain essential raw materials such as timber, metals, and precious stones. Nevertheless, they also faced rebellions and internal conflicts. Sargon and his successors, including Naram-Sin, had to suppress uprisings among subjugated populations and confront threats from mountainous regions to the east, inhabited by groups beyond imperial control. Eventually, the Akkadian Empire entered a period of crisis. Several factors contributed, including difficulties maintaining order in distant provinces, the heavy costs of public works and defense, and the incursions of peoples such as the Gutians from the Zagros Mountains. These groups advanced into the heart of Mesopotamia, causing disorder, weakening central authority, fragmenting governance, and leading to the independence of former city-states. Hittites. They emerged on the Anatolian Peninsula and what is now central Turkey during the Late Bronze Age, roughly between the 17th and 12th centuries before Christ. This people spoke an Indo-European language and adopted much from cultural exchanges with neighboring civilizations such as Mesopotamia and Syria, something reflected in their religious practices, artistic expressions, and the use of cuneiform writing for official matters. Over the generations, the Hittites grew into one of the major powers of the era, eventually rivaling great states such as Egypt and Assyria. Their capital was Hattusa, located in the mountainous area of Anatolia, surrounded by massive walls and equipped with numerous sanctuaries, temples, and palaces. Discovered in the 12th century by European archaeologists, the site revealed clay tablets documenting administration, diplomatic treaties, and mythology, demonstrating a remarkably complex political organization. This striking rise was supported by an economy based on agriculture, livestock, and the trade of metals, which flowed through routes crossing Anatolia and neighboring regions. By the 12th century before Christ, the Hittite civilization faced pressure from both internal and external forces. Succession struggles and invasions by foreign groups, often linked by historians to the so-called Sea Peoples or mountain tribes, undermined their dominance. Eventually, Hattusa was abandoned, and its walls fell after a series of conflicts that shattered centralized power. 32. Mycenaean civilization. It developed in mainland Greece during the Late Bronze Age, between 1600 and 1100 before Christ. Regarded as the heir to the Minoan traditions from Crete, it soon established its own distinctive style that spread across much of the Aegean world. The name comes from the city of Mycenae, located in the northeastern Peloponnese, which served as one of the main political centers of the era. Other important settlements included Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes, all connected through cultural, political, and commercial ties. Mycenaeans used an early form of writing known as Linear B, mainly for administrative and economic records, revealing a high level of organization and bureaucracy. The city of Mycenae stood out for its imposing acropolis, protected by cyclopean walls made of stone blocks so massive that later tradition attributed their construction to giants. Such displays of wealth point to a highly militarized and hierarchical society ruled by powerful elite that organized warfare and maritime expeditions. The decline of Mycenaean civilization occurred gradually. Several theories suggest a combination of internal and external factors, including dynastic disputes, economic crises, and the arrival of invading groups in the Aegean, often associated with the Sea Peoples. Natural disasters such as earthquakes or fires further intensified the collapse of key cities. As palaces fell and trade networks broke down, populations dispersed across the region. (33) Anglo-Saxon civilization. It began after the collapse of the Roman Empire in Britain. Starting in the 4th century, various Germanic peoples, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians settled in what is now England, forming the earliest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The development of Anglo-Saxon civilization was marked by fragmentation and later unification among several kingdoms known as the Heptarchy, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. Over time, internal conflicts and the Viking threat helped certain rulers rise to prominence, such as Alfred the Great, who promoted military reorganization and encouraged the spread of written culture in Old English. Christianization, which began with the mission of St. Augustine of Canterbury in the late 6th century, transformed society by introducing church institutions and establishing ties with the Church of Rome. Anglo-Saxon society revolved around the figure of the king, whose followers benefited from land ownership in exchange for military service and loyalty. This early feudal structure laid the groundwork for the medieval hierarchies that would later dominate Europe. Daily life centered on villages and agriculture, while trade existed both within the island and with other regions of northern Europe. The end of Anglo-Saxon civilization is traditionally dated to 1066 with the Norman conquest led by William the Conqueror after the Battle of Hastings. Even so, many Anglo-Saxon cultural elements endured and merged with Norman influences, forming the foundations of later English culture. '34. Hispanic civilization. Some authors use the term Hispanic civilization to refer to the set of values, institutions, ways of life, and cultural creations forged both on the Iberian Peninsula and in its former overseas colonies, especially during the Golden Age. Beginning with the reign of the Catholic monarchs in the 15th century and the subsequent expansion into other territories, a shared cultural sphere emerged, defined by language, religion, institutions, and customs that spread across continents. Its development was deeply shaped by the various cultures that settled on the Iberian Peninsula. Roman rule left a lasting mark on law, language, and urban planning. After the fall of Rome, the Visigoths established a kingdom that in the 8th century gave way to Muslim conquest. Al-Andalus, at the peninsula, was known under Islamic rule, influenced architecture, science, and philosophy, creating a period of cultural exchange with the rest of Europe. Meanwhile, Christian kingdoms persisted in the north and gradually reclaimed territory during the Reconquista, culminating in final unification. Overseas expansion following the discovery of the Americas in 1492 made possible the creation of a global empire, with trade routes linking Europe to the New World and Asia through the famous Manila Galleon. Among the defining features of Hispanic civilization are the blending of cultural elements of Latin, Germanic, and Arab origin, the central role of Catholicism in shaping identity, and the remarkable spread of the Spanish language, now one of the most widely spoken in the world. Following the expansion of the Spanish Empire during the 16th and 17th centuries, Hispanic architecture spread across vast territories in the Americas and Asia, leaving a legacy that remains visible today. In the Americas, especially in former Inca and Aztec territories, Spanish conquerors built cities and monuments that fused local traditions with European styles of the time, particularly Renaissance and Baroque. For instance, in Mexico City, formerly Tenochtitlan, the Metropolitan Cathedral was constructed atop the ruins of the Aztec Ceremonial Center, while in the old Inca capital of Cusco in present-day Peru, churches and viceregal palaces rose on the foundations of pre-Columbian temples. Across Asia, Spanish presence was concentrated in the Philippines, where the founding of Manila in 1571 marked the beginning of a period of intense commercial and cultural activity. Both in the Aztec and Inca empires, the native population suffered a dramatic decline due to European diseases, forced labor conditions, and wars of conquest. Despite this, Spanish territories experienced a relatively high degree of cultural and racial mixing. Within Catholic churches in colonial towns and cities, records survive showing large numbers of unions between Spaniards, indigenous peoples, and later people of African descent. This process gave rise to a complex caste-based society, generating unique cultural and artistic expressions. The so-called Hispanic civilization began to decline in the 17th century as a result of internal problems and the rise of new global powers. The final blow came in the 19th century with the independence of most American colonies, compounded by defeat in the Spanish-American War of 1898, which resulted in the loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. We have reached the end of our journey through these forgotten civilizations, which once seemed indestructible. They remind us of how fragile human societies can be in the face of time and circumstance. Yet the memory of their achievements, their monuments, and their ideas endures, inviting us to understand them and to avoid repeating their mistakes.